Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray. On this week's show, Adam Boileau and I are going to talk about the week's news, and then we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into the latest DFIR report from CyberCX, which is Adam's former employer. They've just dropped an absolute banger of a report, which is full of really interesting information, trends on TTPs, what attackers are doing, how they're winning. So we'll be talking through that. And of course, this week's sponsor is Dropzone AI, and they make a really interesting tool that you plug into your SOC, and it does all of your tier 1 triage auto-magically with AI, and it is less insane than it sounds. And in this week's sponsor interview, we're chatting with one of the founders of Dropzone, which is Edward Wu, and he'll be talking to us about model coachability, because as it turns out, when you tell an LLM, hey, stop doing this thing, most of the time it just won't listen to you, right? So they've had to put in some work at making these models coachable, which in the context of SOC operations is very, very important. But Adam, just before we get into the news, I just want to do, corrections and clarifications from last week. Someone pointed out to me that I was talking about how amazing it was that malware that did OCR on people's photo reels looking for seed phrases for Bitcoin. I'm like, wow, secrets discovery and whatever. Turns out like those wallet recovery phrases are from a pretty limited dictionary, and doing that is actually not too hard. So my bad on that. And I also had an interesting conversation with an Australian journalist about the Telegram thing. Of course, last week we talked about the sanctions being imposed on Telegram and how that might be linked to a spate of sort of vandalism and, torched cars and whatnot happening in Australia. This journalist, he's a bit skeptical that it's actually Telegram behind that stuff. He pointed to a similar campaign in Sweden, which was actually traced back to Iran, but there was more of a sort of organized crime nexus there. I don't know. But anyway, the point is, he's skeptical. He thinks the sanctions against Telegram could just be the government doing something to be seen to be doing something. Who knows? In time, we will find out. But look, again, we're going to start with Doge news, unfortunately. And again, we're not going to get bogged down into it. Brian Krebs has dropped an absolutely terrific write-up here, which has linked one of these kids that Musk has sent into various bits of the US government to the COM, which is probably not what you want.
Yeah, that is really not a great thing. And Brian's write-up is, as usual, detailed and pulls lots of threads. But, we've seen some reporting about like kind of how these kids that are working for Doge end up in these roles. And this particular kid had come up through Neuralink, Musk's AI startup thingy, but yeah, had been hanging out in the COM. And they're having that crowd rolling around inside the US government, and you kind of get the vibes that they are just going to throw a whole bunch of stuff into an LLM and just kind of see what falls out and call that work. Because it's I don't know, the whole thing is just seems a little bit nuts. But yes, having people from the COM, and especially given the history that the COM has of attacking its own members. I mean, Brian Krebs has got some screenshots and grabs and stuff of people talking about this kid and, the extent to which he can code and so on and so forth. It's just bad all around. Like, you've got leverage against these people. You've got, them not being necessarily very good at what they do. You've got all these connections into violence and organized crime and so on. It's just such a mess.
Well, a lot of them appear to have pretty Nazi stuff tied to their social media accounts, right? And it's just amazing how unlucky Elon Musk is. People keep saying, questioning whether or not he did a Nazi salute. And, that's really unlucky when you're just trying to say my heart comes out to you, as is retweeting Nazi accounts, platforming Nazis, all of the Nazi stuff that seems to happen around Elon Musk. He's just misunderstood.
Just some Nazi bogon flux that just happens to flow around him for some reason. I don't know why.
Unbelievable stuff. And of course, all of this has triggered a deluge of lawsuits from various unions, the ACLU, students, there's just a million lawsuits here. It looks like one of these, a federal judge has ordered a stop to some of this stuff. And I think the Trump camp is just saying, yeah, whatever. And they're kind of ignoring it. You get the sense that this is heading to some sort of constitutional crisis. And it's all traced back to IT systems at this point. And, one thing that occurs to me is that sending a bunch of Nazi 4chan kids into the most sensitive government systems in the United States and getting them to just randomly flick switches and turn things on and off. I think eventually people are going to understand that that's a pretty bad idea. You know, last week we spoke about how it might be great to have some bright young things going in there, figuring out, like drawing insights from government data and whatnot. You know, I don't think that's what's happening here. I think this is headed for something bad. Yeah, I think this is heading for something bad. I mean,
Sure
there's a
feels
couple of
that
different.
way.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to learn that this is a bad idea, like maybe, you know, paying attention in civics and taking some time to understand how government works and why it does what it does, and, you know, about how inefficiencies are sort of inherent at scale, and that's in the private sector as well as the public sector. Or you can do this. You can just keep getting people to flip switches until something big breaks. And yeah, so look, again, we're not going to get bogged down in this, but, you know, we spoke about it last week as a data governance issue. It looks like that's the basis of a lot of these lawsuits, that some of this activity might violate various laws and regulations, and it's all going to the courts, and we'll just see where it goes. But yeah, links to the com, extremely not great, given where
Really
these kids are going, you know, and what they're doing. Now we're going to turn to look, let's get into some actual, you know, proper cybersecurity news now.
Thank God.
Not get bogged down in this. And, you know, something that's interesting too is with this current administration in the United States, they just generate so much, you know, so many things to talk about, and the media is running after every little thing like a golden retriever. And, you know, let's not do that. Let's just cover it very simply and then move on to some more bread and butter stuff. We got a great report here from John Grieg over at The Record talking about a bug in this software called Trimble CityWorks, which is used by municipalities to like manage assets and critical infrastructure and whatnot, or public infrastructure. And people are exploiting this bug. And, you know, that's not good. But this ties back to the discussion we had, you know, a couple of weeks ago about niche SaaS being the next tire fire for, you know, 2025.
Yeah, this particular set of software obviously manages important stuff. And I went and tried to have a rummage to try and find the exploit, because there's very little detail about the bugs itself. It's on the SysOKev list because it's being used in the wild, but I didn't find an exploit. I did find some details about the software, and it feels like a .NET deserialization bug. And usually with these types of software, it's because there's some kind of like secret key that's shared by the vendor across multiple installations. And if you find it in one place, then you can use .NET deserialization to go almost to code exec, kind of by design, because these keys are meant to be unique. That's usually what this is, but we don't know for sure. But either way, getting people shelled.
Yeah, I mean, I should clarify too that this isn't actually SaaS, but it is niche software, right? Because it refers to how you can get RCE on a customer's Microsoft Internet Information Services web server. So you're thinking some sort of deserialization is what would kind of make sense here, right?
Yes, yeah, I think they've said it's deserialization, but we don't know whether it's the usual .NET thing, which is, you know, using a hard-coded key, womp womp.
Yeah, all right. Moving on, and we've talked about DeepSeek a little bit over the last couple of weeks. We've got a report here from Dan Gooden over at Ars. You and I are both like pretty lukewarm on this report, because the headline is DeepSeek iOS app sends data unencrypted to ByteDance controlled servers. I mean, are we really worried about the transit security of this information? Like, I don't think that's the problem. The problem is where it's winding up, not how it's getting there, right? So I think, you know, people are kind of losing the forest for the trees a little bit when they're looking at the risks involved in using DeepSeek.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought, you know, this piece focuses on, as you said, the transport encryption. There's some stuff that's in the clear. There's some stuff that's going to ByteDance rather than DeepSeek itself, presumably because of hosting or whatever else. And then also the use of, I think, triple dares for crypto, which, you know, all of these things point at not particularly mature security practices in an app that's gone viral and gotten big very quickly, but really doesn't, you know, deal with the big picture, which is you can't use a Chinese AI app if you don't trust China. It doesn't really matter how you transport that data to China. You know, that's the bigger picture problem. So yeah, I think it is a case of getting lost in, you know, in the weeds, when really this is a big picture, you know, geopolitical issue, not a technical, you didn't crypto their stuff on the wire issue.
Well, and it's a business issue as well, because I think, you know, the interesting thing for me about all of this is it looks like models might be going commodity, which is going to be very awkward for XAI, OpenAI, all of these companies that have invested gajillions of dollars into models, less meaningful for like Nvidia, who are still going to just sell absolutely gargantuan amount of chips. But I think our colleague Tom Uren, and I've linked through to this in this week's show notes, Tom's newsletter last week, he had a take on DeepSeek that I thought was very interesting, which is currently, Google will do a, threat report or whatever on malicious use of, say, Gemini. OpenAI will do the same thing. Now that there's an indigenous capability in China, we're going to lose insight into how Chinese APT crews, for example, are using this technology in their operations. And I think that's a really, interesting component to this. It was always going to happen. And I guess, there are, open source models they could have been using or whatever, but they still obviously found value in using some of the cloud-based models to do various things. And we're just going to lose insight there.
Yeah, I think, absolutely. The open source ones are useful and handy, but like the thing that made DeepSeek really stand out is that it was producing stuff that was as good as, and in some cases better than, the very, very expensive models, the commercial ones, the ones that took so much work to build for the various US firms. And the fact that, DeepSeek itself was open source. So you can, many actors beyond just China now have access to something that's as good as those. So, this industry is so young and it's developing so quickly that, keeping a lid on it was never going to be a good strategy for controlling it. But the visibility we did get from those reports, was interesting.
Yeah, and that is gone.
Yes.
Now let's follow up on Paragon. The news, I think, when was it, last week, week before, we were talking about how the Paragon spyware was popping up on journalists' phones and stuff. And this was really not great for them, having just agreed to be sold off to some, American private equity firm. And as I said last week, I would expect that would be complicating their deal. It's Paragon itself has now booted Italy as a customer for violating its terms of service, which say you can't do this. This is interesting, and I feel like I wonder if this would happen if all of the action hadn't have been taken against NSO. I sort of feel like all of the stuff that was done to NSO for this sort of activity has resulted in this company now going, oh no, and booting Italy as a customer. I suspect that one thing that's different here, though, is NSO controlled the malware delivery. I don't think that's the case for Paragon, so they don't have quite the same level of insight into how their customers are deploying this software. But, if it is the case that Italy was misusing this, I mean, what do you do if you're like one of these spyware companies? What, you can't sell to Italy because you suspect they're going to do human rights abuses? I don't know. This is so complicated, all of this.
Yeah, it really is. And I think you are right that I think the action against NSO has probably brought this into a focus that it wouldn't have otherwise had, like that, plus them now being, acquired by a US firm, and the US being such a big market. I think Tom makes the point that, all the different US agencies purchase these tools independently. It's not like you buy one license for the US government. And so the US is an extra big market for these companies because they can sell to so many places there, whereas presumably the Italians buy it once, kind of thing. But yeah, it's, is there there's plenty of people who would argue that maybe there isn't an ethical way to sell spyware, right? That, you can sell it to your own government, maybe at best, but once you start dealing with others, then you end up in positions like this, because Italy, member of the EU, surely they should be, a reasonable customer. But, between the stuff in Poland, the stuff in Italy, stuff in Spain, maybe Europe, isn't the safe customer if you're an Israeli spyware firm, which, funny world, right?
Yeah, it is. And you just sort of think, I touched on this last year through some of our discussions, where just the existence of this stuff, I think for so many countries that couldn't develop it in-house, so to speak, the temptation to misuse it is just so great. And we see it being misused in unexpected places. If anything, I'm sort of impressed that we haven't seen the stuff sold to Five Eyes countries popping up where it shouldn't, right? Because we have not seen that so far. But it does surprise me when you're seeing wow, Italy is popping shells on journalists' phones. That's what the allegation is here. It's turning into a bit of a political scandal in Italy as well, not surprisingly.
Yeah, it is. And they haven't quite gone down the same route as, Poland has gone because of the, which government was in power, et cetera, et cetera. But it's, the temptation, I guess, is irresistible. And, part of me wonders that, because of the long history of electronic espionage in the Five Eyes, like, do we have more mature approaches to governance and approaches to like oversight and stuff because we've been doing it for a long time? But then again, spying is a very old profession. So yeah, I don't know what, I don't know what it is with the Europeans. Like, you would think that they'd be a little better behaved.
Get your act together, guys. Come on. But I think you hit on it there, which is the oversight is right. And I think certain things that happened in the English-speaking world, particularly in the United States, resulted in good oversight. And I'm thinking of things like, Watergate, for example. As soon as politicians realized that intelligence agencies could threaten them, then it's like oversight. That's how it happens. So I think I do think some of this is just sort of historical, and the oversight in the English speaking world is actually pretty good. And there's reasons for that. We've also got a report from Lorenzo over at TechCrunch looking at the specifics of a couple of the people who were targeted, and they're people who run like refugee organizations and other people who run like news websites that have been critical of the government and whatnot. So yeah, definitely a bad look for Italy.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, not great.
Not great. Now, Apple has patched a security flaw that has made people very excited, because they described in their sort of advisory or their patch announcement that it was being used, it was extremely sophisticated and being used against very specific targets, like with physical access to the devices. Everyone was thinking James Bond. I'm kind of thinking probably Cellbrite, right? But they have patched a bug that allowed you to bypass like the sort of, how they disable the fun bits of the USB interface until you've authenticated to a computer. This bug would allow you to essentially present yourself to an iOS device as a trusted device.
Yeah. Anything that weakens those controls, I guess, is of concern. But also, it wasn't that long ago that we didn't have those controls. So it kind of shows that they have been pretty effective, the things that Apple have added to, lock the device down when it hasn't been used in a while or unlocked in a while. So, kind of a win in a way.
Yeah, and you'd imagine, like, if you're a company like Cellbrite, you would have another one of these, like the plan would be to have another one of these ready to go when the one that you're relying on is inevitably patched. I think the people I know who work in exploit dev, the stuff they worry about are the big changes to iOS, like various mitigations that squash whole classes of bugs and whatever. So you would think they'll have another one ready to go, but it is getting harder now. So, we might be heading to a situation where, companies like Cellbrite won't have coverage for modern iOS, for example, for a period of time at least.
Yeah, you certainly talk to people who work in that game, and they say their jobs are getting harder, right? I mean, it's no easy days in the iOS exploit dev business.
No, that's right. It's not exactly a low stress occupation these days. What do we got? We got some US sanctions hitting a Russian-based like bulletproof hosting company. I mean, this is good, right? Like, I wonder what sort of effect this is going to have now that, Russia is almost running like this parallel decoupled economy these days. But, broadly speaking, I think these sort of actions are pretty good. And that dovetails nicely with another item that we're speaking about this week. James Reddick has the report for the record, which is Thailand has cut power, fuel, and internet access to scam hubs in parts of Thailand. I mean, this is something that I advocated for, I think it was last year, where I'm like, why don't we just cut connectivity to these compounds? If you're going to concentrate huge amounts of activity in a physical location, surely you can make life tough for those compounds. It looks like that's what's happening now.
Yeah, when you've got compounds that are serving, 100,000 scammers, like that's got to make a pretty big dent in terms of power utilization, all the aircon and all of the computers and so on, plus the comms. So yeah, the Interior Minister of Thailand posed for a photo op at the control center for the local power company turning off. And
I gotta say, I'm very disappointed that the photo shows him holding a mouse where he's about to click the power off button. I would hope they would mock up a Hillary Clinton reset style button that he could smash for the cameras, but no, click.
Yeah, boring. I mean, an axe through a spare, big, nice, thick power cable with some sparks flying off. That would be a good photo op. But no, I was looking for some details about how they like how granular are the power cuts was the question I had. Like, are they
I was
cutting
wondering
off?
that as well. Like, are they cutting off nearby homes?
Yes,
Like, how
right.
does
Like,
that
is there
work?
collateral damage, or like, are they targeting individual like power subscribers based on their usage? Like, I wanted to see a few details. I did click around a bunch of the reporting, and no one seemed to have answered that kind of question, because it would be sad if there were if there was collateral damage to other people that just happen to live in the in the neighborhood or nearby or whatever else. But on the other hand, I guess they said what to the Thai economy, it's costing them what $2 million a day in scamming,
Yeah.
versus and
Yeah. I mean, the
also
whole
the
thing's
public.
Yeah, the whole thing's really nuts. And Thailand and China are actually setting up a coordination center in Bangkok to try to tackle this, because a lot of Chinese citizens are being sort of stolen, kidnapped, and forced to work in these compounds. So, China's involved in cracking down on this. I think the Russians are getting involved as well, and the Americans. Like, I feel like finally we're seeing some movement here. There's a great piece from CNN about a Chinese actor who turned up for like a casting call or whatever in like somewhere in Southeast Asia and wound up being sort of vanned and taken to one of these compounds. And they got him back after a few days. But this turned into a really big sort of issue in China. And, given the number of their citizens that are being sort of stolen, it's something I mentioned before. I know someone who works at like a jobs listing website, and they had this issue years ago where I think it was in the Philippines, because they operate in the Philippines as well, where people were turning up for job interviews and then just disappearing, and they did not know why. So, it turned out this is where they were going. But obviously, what do? You work in the sort of anti-fraud and sort of user safety department of a job listing websites, and then your job candidates start going missing. Like, what do you even do?
Yeah,
like, it's crazy.
That is a mess. Yes, actually, I also clicked through to the link about that Chinese actor guy, because
Yeah.
that seemed to have caused the Chinese to do some things. I think also there was some government visit from someone in Thailand into China as well. So I think that probably has applied a bit of pressure to them. Go shake some hands and show some progress, etc. So whatever
I
gets
think
the
it's
job
a lot
done
of
in the
it's
end.
a lot of it's going to be coordination and resources and
Yeah,
whatever. And I
yeah.
think my point is everybody's on the same page. It's got bad enough that everybody's like, okay, we've got to do something about this. Again, it's going to be like ransomware, right? Where, Release the Hounds was never about, going after ransomware actors was never about ransomware elimination. It's about suppression. It's about at least making it somewhat difficult. Tom's writing up he's doing a write up for this week's newsletter. We just spoke to him this morning, and there is progress there. Like the total profits, the total revenue going to ransomware crews is down. There's less big game stuff, more targeting SMEs. Like, the economy is the ransomware economy is contracting. I hear through sources that some of these offensive operations against ransomware crews are actually having an effect. Like, they're ongoing. Like, governments aren't talking about them, but they are doing. The hounds are out there, man, and they're causing a ruckus, right, for ransomware operators. So that's interesting.
Good job, hounds. Good job.
Good job, hounds. I know we've got a lot of hounds listening to this, so
Yes.
happy hunting. So let's stay with Southeast Asia now. And we've seen a bunch of arrests by Thai police of ransomware actors. And then we saw like a DOJ indictment land that might be connected to that, but we're not entirely sure. Walk us through this.
So the 8base ransomware crew got a bunch of their infrastructure taken down with a coordinated law enforcement operation in Europe and the UK, FBI, usual kind of people. They arrested 4 people in Thailand. And then, yes, simultaneously, we saw a DOJ release saying that they had charged a couple of Russian men for their role in the Phobos ransomware infrastructure, ransomware gang. And 8base and Phobos are pretty well tied together. Like, they share a lot of plumbing and things. So I think those are the same people. No one has specifically said that. The DOJ says they're in custody, and the Thai police arrested 2 men and 2 women. So I think it probably lines up, but that crew goes back quite a long way through other ransomware groups. So yeah, these are experienced people. So good work, feds.
Sucks to be you guys.
Mm-hmm.
Now look, we've seen a whole round of coverage about this guy Tigran Gambarian. I don't know. I always fail pronouncing his name. He was the guy who worked for, what was it, Binance?
Binance, yeah.
Binance, yeah. So he was a guy who worked for Binance who got detained in Nigeria because the government held him like personally responsible for the currency they're tanking, because really the government had mismanaged the economy and a lot of people were starting to use stablecoins through platforms like Binance, which, you know, can't blame them for voting with their feet and, you know, going to a stable form of currency. But yeah, government didn't like it. They put him in prison. He was going to be there 20 years. Eventually he got out. I mean, this is a story that's been going on for quite a while. We've talked a lot about it. The Record, Dina Temple-Raston and Sean Powers have a write-up here, and indeed he appeared on their podcast. We've also got a write-up from Andy Greenberg, who was apparently in touch with this guy while he was imprisoned. And yeah, just a fascinating story. And I guess this would be our reading list item for this week.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting details about kind of the process and how it kind of went down. Like if you're trying to imagine what it's like, you know, being arrested as part of essentially, you know, sort of almost like a blackmail operation, you know, and where international, you know, the Nigerian government in this case, you know, just kind of wanted to hold someone responsible, show they were doing something. And seeing the inside of that process, I think, is insightful, especially for those of our listeners that work in, you know, in cryptocurrency and in areas of cybercrime where you kind of get messed up in this stuff, like to see how badly it can go. So yeah, definitely worth a read. Just, you know, for those little details of like, how do you buy a cell phone in a prison in Nigeria when they think you're a billionaire cryptocurrency mogul, as opposed to, you know, well, he was used to work at the IRS. So I guess he had, you know, some federal government, you know, kind of salary, but wasn't really a rich man. Anyway, just lots of interesting details. Go have a read. Yeah,
indeed. Now, we're going to talk about this threat report from CyberCX. CyberCX, of course, is the sort of large Australian security consultancy which bought the business where you worked. You were kind of a co-founder at Insomnia Security, which was acquired by CyberCX. They bought, for people outside of Australia, they might not know, they went around and they just bought up a bunch of consultancies. It was like a private equity roll-up. And, you know, as a result, they are the big player in Australian cybersecurity services these days. We don't have a business relationship with them. You know, you did work there for years after the acquisition, but you are no longer there. You were full-time Risky Biz. But they've dropped an absolute banger of a DFIR report. Unfortunately, it is like retro-walled, so you have to cough up your email address to get a copy of it. But it's probably worth it, right? Because as far as these sort of reports go, this is a good one.
Yeah, I mean, the incident response team over at CyberCX are absolutely the best in the region. Like, they are very good at what they do, and they get some really interesting places. So, yeah, I think it's worth a read, even if you do have to fill in a form.
Now, there's some really interesting key findings here. Where's that? Page 5, right? So the key findings just on their own are very interesting. One is that MFA, if you're not using phishing-resistant MFA, you're not doing really anything to slow down business email compromise, because phish kits these days grab session tokens, not credentials. And I think this is something that's not perhaps well understood enough these days. If you're not using some sort of WebAuthn or U2F or YubiKey or some sort of phishing-resistant you know, MFA technology, it's rubbish. Like, you know, you're basically not using anything at all.
Yeah. And I think they specifically talk about a case they had where someone got compromised and they had conditional access policies restricting logins to only come from Australia. And the actor just went, no problem. We'll come from a, you know, NordVPN or whatever out of Queensland, you know, job done, move on, because those kinds of controls are not effective against an attacker that's motivated. And, you know, that's get the job done whatever way works.
Now, some other key findings here that are less interesting to talk about, like the healthcare industry was the most represented sector. Some stolen data is never advertised on the dark web, it just gets stolen. But a couple of interesting bits here. Espionage-aligned incidents, like the dwell time, is insane, right? So you got the financially motivated actors who do smash and grab. And then when you look at the espionage stuff, like the time to detect was 400 days. And this represents espionage-related incidents. I mean, it's 5% of their caseload, so it's a non-trivial amount of incidents.
Yeah, no, they definitely do a lot of work in that kind of area. And the contrast of dwell time, I mean, the averages kind of are skewed around by some of the big numbers, but I mean, you know, you're talking, you know, 3 years in some cases of dwell time in an organization before the actor gets snapped. And I think even then, some of those are because they also get ransomware or also get other actors in there. And then you start investigating. And once you roll IR, you find, all of the, Chinese or whoever are up in the exchange service stealing your
Well,
emails
we
for the
saw a
last years.
story this week about some company in the United States that makes label makers or whatever. They got ransomware and then they did DFIR, and it turned out like they'd been mage carded for 8 months before that or something.
Yeah.
So this is a thing that happens. But then there's the other interesting findings here, which is there's a downward trend of like C2 framework usage because of EDR, right? Yeah. So you can't just Cobalt strike your way around to glory anymore, but that is sort of counterbalanced by finding that EDR is just too often misconfigured or not appropriately monitored and is not doing what it should be doing.
Yeah, I think that was one of the takeaways here, is that EDR is definitely causing problems for attackers, because there's a couple of areas where they are changing their behavior. So, for example, the increased use of DLL sideloading to circumvent EDR detections, but that, yes, EDR still has to be monitored and configured correctly to be effective. And clearly, although it's being deployed more, it's still not, not doing everything that people expect of it, just because, hey, this is fiddly and complicated and you do need to monitor it and tune it and so on.
Yeah, I mean, DLL sideloading, right? I think it's important that people understand that EDR will flag it. It's going to pop an alert. Like when something shady happens as a result of a DLL being sideloaded, it's going to generate alerts. But they're only useful if someone is actually watching the alerts. Yes. And I think that's what people don't necessarily realize about EDR is without the monitoring piece and good monitoring, it doesn't really get you as far as people realize. Like the endpoint protection side of it is not incredible.
Yeah, but they talk a bit in this report about attackers using web shells for backdoor for long-term access to long-term persist, and those of course don't trigger EDR until you use them. So you can go sprinkle them around the web servers, and then sure, you're going to get snapped when you spawn a CMD with them, but until then you've still got to weigh in, and then you've just got to outrun the people looking at the logs and the response and so on. So it gives you an opportunity to have another swing in it, even if you get evicted next time.
Yeah, it's funny actually. One of the recommendations in the report is that people consider using Airlock Digital, which, as everyone knows, I'm a huge fan of, but also CCX are actually a shareholder in Airlock, so I think that's actually a bit cheeky. But
it's
look, I mean,
also the right solution to the problem. So.
Well, that's the thing. It is also the right solution to the problem, right? Which is they specifically solve these sorts of issues, right? Like you might have a couple of exceptions or whatever, like, yeah, you're going to have a few exceptions and maybe an attacker gets lucky, but still it's going to slow them down and whatever. And like it is shifting that whole protection left, right? Which is you can't even execute it. You're not relying on a tool to detect something after it's gone. You're stopping it from happening in the first place. But, all in all, an interesting report. And something that was interesting. So we've got someone starting on Monday, basically like a trial run to see if she likes working with us and if we like working with her for this editing job, right? Doing production and, editing text, video, audio, all sorts of stuff. Cause we're at the scale now where we need that. It's cool actually, cause it's actually Amberly Jack, who's the sister of the late Barnaby Jack. And when I first met Barnaby, like the first thing he ever said to me is like, my sister's a journalist. And so it feels very cool that she's going to come and, see how she likes working with us. But it meant that I had to go through the process, the mental exercise of thinking, well, we're going to need to provision her with some sort of managed device, right? And what sort of protections are we going to need to put on that device? And there were three, and it almost surprised me where I landed, because the three things that I decided we would need to provision to our one remote user, who really needs this stuff because she's going to have access to a lot of social media, our CMS, et cetera, I thought, okay, Airlock Digital for the anti-malware side and to restrict browser extensions, because they do that now as well. We've got Knock Knock to restrict access to our content management system. So that ties that to her, Google Workspace SSO status. Can use Google Workspace to limit OAuth grants. And we're going to have to set that up, and that's going to be a nightmare in terms of like navigating the Google Workspace admin interface to actually make that happen.
So much white space, and yet still so difficult to use. What are you doing, Google?
Yeah. And then the final piece, right? And this is the one that I thought was surprising, is like, because I always, I kind of thought they were a nice to have, and I've realized they're more of a must have now. And, full disclaimer, I am an advisor to the company, but push security. because they make a browser plugin which is going to detect these phish kits that are outlined in this report, right? And stop. They've got password protection features as well, where you can't actually reuse passwords in, on different sites and whatnot. It just won't let you paste them in. And it also does, phish kit detection to detect the major phish kits that do this token theft stuff. So I thought that was just a really interesting thought exercise where, I didn't land on CrowdStrike and an MDM solution. I landed on some stuff that is, I guess, kind of esoteric, but is actually going to solve the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I thought, we've talked about this a bunch, about, what we're going to do and how we're going to do it and so on. And it's been interesting to walk through this exercise of like, what does a 2025 AD new setup for this look like? Like, what do we need? How are we going to make it work? It is a different list than, perhaps at first blush you would have thought of. So I guess we'll talk to our listeners later on once we've, had some experience with it and see how it works for us. And if we get,
and we're not posing this as a challenge, by the way, to anyone who would like to bypass these controls. We're doing the best we can, but I don't know. You're the CISO, right? So,
gee, thanks, buddy. Yes, well,
I can just blame you.
If someone wants to face our stuff, then post on our LinkedIn, then well, best of luck to you.
Yeah. Now look, just going back to that report for a moment, another thing that it's highlighted, and this is something that I'm hearing across the board from everyone I talk to who's adjacent to incidents, which is living off the land, is that used to be kind of niche, and now it is just standard workflow, right? And just more and more people are just using whatever baked in tools they can, whatever existing code there's there that you can misuse. That's how people are doing it. And we'll talk about the lolbins, but also this report looks at how an attacker was actually using Microsoft's e-discovery tools to do exfil, which is just like, it makes total sense, but it's also like a little bit, you rub your temples a bit thinking about that. But I can't say I'm terribly surprised that people are moving more towards lolbins. Yeah,
it makes sense that lolbins and also existing kind of remote management tools, either ones that exist in in Windows, but also ones that are in use in the environment or are generally widely available. They also call out the use of cloud for data exfil. So rather than having to rar up your files and send them out the old-fashioned way, where you might get spotted by DLP controls or whatever else, like using cloud-based file storage, whatever that's already in use in the environment to exfil it. If your data's already up there in the cloud and they can get it out, then you're not sending it out of the network a second time. So that was interesting. I think one of the cases they worked, the same one with the e-discovery for stealing people's email, they were also added like extra credentials to the cloud accounts used by the like mail filtering provider they were using. So just logged into the Azure portal and the Entra ID portal, and then add extra accounts to that so that you can then use that to exfil the mail. So an increased agility in using those kind of cloud environments and using those tools against you, be it OAuth grants, be it setting up extra accounts with access. I think one of them, they set up Microsoft Graph API access so they could use that to query data out of the cloud remotely. So and what's funny is how the new stuff echoes the old stuff, because a lot of the time they're spinning up accounts that have MFA exceptions because they're essentially service accounts, but cloud, right? And it's like, oh my God, we're just, we've made progress, but in some ways we're kind of back where we started. Yeah. These are all the same flavors, but all the same things, but just like a different flavor, like the same, pattern, but in the cloud versus on-prem. And it does make you wonder, like if you did the old, classic Brett Moore, same bug, different app spreadsheet, where you make a list of all the applications and all of the bugs that you know about, and then look at the gaps where those bugs don't exist in other products that you use, then you can, what bugs to go look for. There is a lot of scope for exactly the same thing here with on-prem AD and business, business networks to Azure and, Entra and all of the cloud stack. So lots to be found there. Lots of fun to be had.
Yeah. It's so funny that we've spent 20 years like throwing mud at AD. Yeah. And then, we kind of realize, well, okay, there's some serious foot guns in AD, but even when you take them away and you move to an all singing, all dancing cloud future, identity abuse, is just inherent to any directory.
Yeah.
Right. It's an inherent problem. And the tooling on AD is okay now. Cloud tooling for this stuff, I mean, now we're seeing a lot of investment activity and a lot of startups trying to address this problem, but they're not mature yet. Like it is kind of insane where we are at the moment. You look at how people are running through organizations, and you just think, well, we should have been better prepared for this, and we're not.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, like whilst AD was a mess, it kind of moved more slowly than the cloud, right? Because it took us a long time to go from NT351, NT4, whatever it was that they introduced, the kind of what became modern on-premise Active Directory. Like it took us 10, 15 years to really get our heads around how to do that robustly. Whereas the cloud, right, it's just moved, especially, Azure and Entra, like it's moving so quickly that no one has time to figure out what's best practice or whatever else. And, we're going to be finding new and exciting things in that setup for such a long time. And actually, the other thing that while you were talking about AD, that occurred to me was we can imagine like a parallel future where, Sun hadn't been ruined and Sun's LDAP and Unix environment and network as the computer future had happened. We would have all these same problems, except they'd be in Sun's LDAP and, one directory, whatever it was called. And it would totally be worse. Sun RPC services getting rid. I mean, I'd love it, but, the Windows future happened. But it would have, we would have been in this boat regardless of, Microsoft or Sun or whoever else, Novell.
Well, I think, look, another thing that is interesting to me about all of this is just how much this reinforces the idea that the browser is the new operating system, because that's where OAuth grants are made, for example. And OAuth grants are the new code execution, and, authentication tokens are the new, means of, the new tokens, that you bear to prove an identity, and that may lead to code execution. And like, it's just crazy how much of this is just about browsers, granting authorizations and exchanging tokens. And that can lead to a full compromise of cloud environments. And to make it worse, like external SaaS as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of where we ended up with, Airlock for controlling the underlying OS and making that robust, and Push for making the actual real OS, i.e. the browser, do things that we kind of need to manage from like the high level security properties that actually really matter. Whereas, underlying file system permissions or whatever else, underneath the browser, really not that relevant anymore. And,
I mean, the missing bit there is the OAuth grants, right? Which you kind of have to do, in our case, because we're a Google shop, we have to do that via Google. Can't really do that with Push. They do some limited stuff there, and you can actually use that tool to pull in like what's authorized and whatever, get a bit of a list. But in terms of controls, and then, oh man, I mean, Airlock covering browser extensions is good because that's been away. Malicious extensions that leads to token theft and whatever. But yeah, it's just all the action is identity and, the way the browser interacts with the identity and stuff. I do feel like we've solved, or at least, we've got good tools for some of those old challenges. And, what does this mean for ransomware? Right? When we look at all of this, what does this mean for ransomware? Are we going to see more attacks against cloud services? And I think we absolutely will, which is just great.
I mean, at some point the internet will run out of vulnerable Fortinets,
yes,
and they'll have to come up with some new tricks.
I mean, I don't think that's going to happen very quickly, unfortunately, but
dear.
Crazy stuff. Anyway, that concludes our discussion about the CyberCX threat report. We've put a link into the landing page in this week's show notes, but congrats to all of the people who worked on that. It was very thought-provoking, interesting stuff. And of course, that concludes also our news segment this week. Adam Boileau, thank you so much for joining me. We'll do it all again next week.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pat. We certainly will.
That was Adam Boileau there with a check of the week's news and also a discussion of the CyberCX threat report. Very interesting stuff. This week's show is brought to you by Dropzone. Dropzone makes a AI-based tier 1 SOC analyst, right? So it can do some of that drudgery that all of the SOC analysts have to do in terms of like looking at those first stage alerts, seeing if they're a false positive or worth investigating. It's very cool. I've been through it with Edward, who's our next guest, Edward Wu, who's one of the co-founders of Dropzone. And it's very interesting stuff. Now, They have been around a little bit longer than some of the new entrants who are sort of flooding this space, right? It's a really sensible application for AI, which is why there are so many companies now flooding the zone. And because they've been around for a while, they've been able to bump into a lot of the corner cases that pop up when you're trying to use an LLM to automate this sort of low-level decision making. And one of the issues they've come across is actually an interesting one, which is model coachability. AI models, as it turns out, they're really stubborn. Like you'll tell them stop doing that, and they're like, yeah, whatever, meat sack. I'm a robot. I know better, right? So they just keep doing the same old stuff. So this is something that Edward and his team have had to work at really quite hard. And here's Edward talking about all of that. Enjoy.
Most AI agents, when you first build them, they're kind of like this. They come across as somewhat smart, but very stubborn because they don't take your input. They ignore, specific organizational policies and practices you wanted to adopt. So what we have done is, as we are building our product, we added a number of capabilities that allows the users of our AI SOC analyst to influence the activity, the technique, and the behavior of our AI system. And by doing that, we transform an AI agent from somebody who is very kind of smart but quite stubborn to somebody who is smart but can actually listen to additional instructions and do things in a way that aligns with other members of the team.
Yeah, and I'd imagine too that this type of coachability, to some degree, like it's better than coaching a human because you only need to tell it once.
Correct.
It's, you're not going to have, it's not going to leave. It's not going to resign and be replaced with someone else who hasn't had those instructions. So why don't you, first of all, let's talk about like what you can coach it to do, and then we can talk about how you actually do it. So what sort of stuff? We were talking earlier, and it's sort of stuff like, if you don't alert on this unless it happens over here, or maybe we want to know about this if it happens over there. It's that sort of stuff, isn't it? It's really the sort of instructions and training you would give to someone, a human in the SOC.
Correct. Yeah. So there's a couple concrete examples. One very common example is, hey, we are a cloud native AWS shop. We have 500 different AWS accounts. We frequently get publicly exposed S3 bucket alerts. It's a very common alert. But hey, for these 50 accounts, we actually don't care too much about this type of alerts in those accounts, because those accounts were for our partners, and we're just stuffed a bunch of fake data into it. So people can play with it. So that's kind of, one concrete example where something, it's something that you would have told a new hire joining the security team as well.
But I can see exactly why you would have needed to do this, right? Because initially it just would have been stubbornly alerting on something like that in a test environment. There was no real way to tell it not to, right? So yeah, that's funny.
Yeah, so these kind of it could be organizational policy, preference, or sometimes practices, right? This team always does this. You should keep that in mind as you are looking at security alerts. The director of IT has a script that he or she runs every now and then to reset people's MFAs for a variety of different reasons. And this behavior is actually expected. So these kind of, organizational knowledge is one type of coaching that can be done. But another type of coaching is more about, hey, when you are looking at AWS alerts, I want you to look at this specific label that's associated with asset. Why? Because in our organization, we use this label to determine if it's prod or dev.
Yeah.
So, not something that you should be doing everywhere, but in our environment, we use this label. This label is like the ground truth of a lot of assets. And as an AI SOC analyst, you should really look at this label and consider the value of that label as you are looking at security alerts. So that's another example. It's less about the context. It's more about like specific techniques that's unique to the environment.
So how do you actually achieve this with a large language model? I'd imagine that, say you want to get it to do a thing, You enter that somewhere into the drop zone interface, and then in the background, what is it
Yep.
continuously reminding it? Hey, keep in mind when you process all queries that you need to do X, Y, and Z. Is that I mean, that's just me, an idiot who doesn't really understand AI all that well. That's how I'd imagine it would work.
Yeah, yeah. One way you can think of it, it's kind of, you know, I'm sure you have heard of systems like RAG, right? So it's a kind of essentially a retrieval augmented system where, very similar to, how, like, for example, when we go through our day-to-day lives, when I walk out of the door, subconsciously, the activity of walking out of the door and closing the door, creates this reminder I should have probably locked the door as well as I exit my house. And like I would say, the coachability or the subsystem actually works in a very similar way. You monitor what the agent is doing, and when the agent is performing certain activities that correlates to certain configured, you can say, tips or suggestions or devices that the human user has kind of wanted to remember, it will recall that advice, and then which will help to remind the system, hey, as you are looking at AWS assets and you are trying to understand the context about an AWS asset, remember, this user, 2 weeks ago told you that you should look at this label. So it is kind of a retrieval augmented generation system where, depending on the activity of the agent, the system is recalling certain advices and tips, and using that to remind the agent, here are some additional things you should be looking at.
It's still pretty mind-bending, all of this stuff. Now, we should point out too that, your customers, their data isn't just going into consumer grade models. Like, everybody kind of gets their own instance of these things. What's interesting is, I work doing some advisory with you, and I know early on, like, you would run into a bit of a barrier where people were a little bit nervous about, like, well, is my log data going to start training like ChatGPT and then leak out through people's queries? And of course, people are getting more comfortable with the idea of, oh, okay, no, you can sort of license your own tenant, and there's contracts which say they can't train based on your data and whatever, and there's a certain level of confidentiality that's similarly to when you get an EC2 instance on Amazon, etc. And one thing that's changed recently, and I find this really interesting, is where some of the business, what some of the business drivers are that are leading people to actually reach out to you at the moment, and it is boards having a meeting and saying, we need to find ways to make our business more efficient by using AI. And they're sending that out to every single department, every single manager in their entire enterprise. And that's driving a lot of inbound for you. And I think that's really fascinating that we're seeing this as absolutely a top-down thing from boards who are like, we've got to find ways to paste AI into every corner of our business to extract that efficiency. I mean, that's been a recent change, hasn't it?
Yeah, we have noticed a huge uptick from organizations that, as they wrap up 2024, they are looking at 2025. I think, between the recent DeepSeek announcements to NVIDIA stock crashing to the $500 billion of Stargate projects, I think Gen AI is definitely on top of mind. Frankly, at this point, it feels a little bit difficult to even isolate yourself from some of those news. I wish there is like
you go home at the end of the day, the last thing you want to think about is LLMs. You turn on the news and there it is, right?
Yeah, and I get calls, from my parents like, hey, when are you building a stock trading AI, using large language models? It seems it's all over the place. But yeah, I would say we have noticed definitely a tremendous uptick in the number of organizations where it's a board level mandate. Like, we need to improve the efficiency in every single business function. And that obviously includes security teams. And unsurprisingly, one of the most universal and glaringly obvious need for a security team is alert investigations. Detection and response is a core component of most security teams. And as a result of that, we have definitely been getting tons of inbound interest in learning about how our technology can allow security teams to do a whole lot more than what they are currently doing, but without doubling the budget or doubling the headcount.
Yeah, it is. I feel like, 2025, there's going to be a lot of prime time, a lot of people using AI for real stuff. But I mean, you built Dropzone to do what it does for a reason, because it is frankly the most obvious use case for large language models in security.
Yeah, it's definitely a very good use case as well. Because from our perspective, our goal, and when we are building Dropzone, it's not to replace human engineers to human analysts.
Yes,
But the
to
goal
take away
is to
the grindy, boring, crappy parts of their job, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have seen that not only in enterprise security teams, we have also seen that with some of our early adopters and customers on the service discovery front. As you can imagine, most managed detection and response and managed security service providers have a lot of security analysts. And frankly, a lot of these security analysts are, doing 24/7 alert investigation, not because they couldn't do something that's more interesting and higher value. It's because out of necessity. So one thing we have been helping, in addition to enterprise, but service providers on, is allowing them to up-level their team so they can allow the existing talent and engineers they have on their staff to offer and work on higher value projects, whether it's, SIEM configuration, visibility fabric deployment, security architecturing, red teaming, and pen testing, instead of
endlessly triaging things that probably aren't incidents. Yeah. No,
Exactly.
I get what you're saying. It's funny though, because like one thing I know through discussions we've had is there's really two different types of MSSPs out there, or MDRs. There's the ones who have like hacked up DIY, horrible stuff where you're limited in what you can do there. But there are these new categories of MDR where they're using some of the more established off-the-shelf tools. They might have a multi-tenant arrangement of some big existing commercial SIEM or whatever, and you're having a lot of success there.
Yeah, absolutely. What we have seen is a lot of these MDRs or MSSPs, like you said, they will have a multi-tenanted, license of a large SIEM, and then because that's what allows them to achieve economic of scale. And then in addition to that, they will oftentimes build their own content packs on top of those SIEMs. So they're not, taking Splunk, Sumo Logic, or Panther and just running it, but they are actually building additional detection content pack, which to some extent is their unique value proposition, right? They have taken their expertise in security and built additional detection rules that's relevant to the segment of customers and organizations they service. And with those organizations, because they are using kind of the same SIEM across different organizations and different clients, that really allow us, an automation product like us to plug into their ecosystem and help them, autonomously take alerts from this multi-tenant SIEM, perform investigations by pivoting across different data sources and tables within the SIEM, and ultimately, generate draft investigation reports that the service providers their human analysts can, review and build on top of.
We're out of time. Edward Wu, great to see you. Great to talk to you. Always a fascinating conversation, and we'll chat again through the year.
Thank you.
That was Edward Wu from Dropzone there, and you can find Dropzone at dropzone.ai. And full disclosure, I am an advisor to that company. I'm into it. Really cool stuff. And that actually wraps up this week's edition of Risky Business. I do hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back through this week with more Risky Business for you all and another weekly show next week. But until then, I've been Patrick Gray. Thanks for listening.